Hello, everyone. My name is Chip Gibbons. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a member of Metro DC Democratic Socialist of America. This is our Socialist Night School, which is a series of talks we have that assume no prior knowledge. They're for people who are looking for sort of an introduction to various issues. Tonight, we're very lucky that we have speakers not just in DC, where we're based, but also in India. We're joined tonight by Varsha Gandhi-Koto-Nutella, who is a member of the cabinet of Progressive International and leads its policy pillar, Blueprint. Prior to Progressive International, she worked on a global reproductive justice campaign at the Women's Deliver in New York. And she's from India and is coming to us from India. We're also joined by Michael Gallant, who is coming to us from Mount Pleasant, not quite as far away. And he is also on the Secretariat of the Progressive International and helps to coordinate its media pillar, The Wire. He's also a member of DSA's International Committee Secretariat and organizes with the Economic and Trade Subcommittee at the DSA's International. And most importantly, he's a member of Metro DC DSA. So let's give it up to Varsha and Michael.
Thanks all.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to be here. And I'm calling in from Hyderabad in India, as Chip just mentioned. Really excited to talk to you all. I guess a disclaimer right at the beginning, as we talk about vaccine apartheid, is that I'm no expert in any way on global health or the vaccine question. But as Chip mentioned, Michael and I, and many of us, as many of you, I'm sure, have been working on the vaccine question and just the big question on top of all of our heads of how do we end this pandemic. So in that sense, I think we've all become a bit of quack kind of epidemiologists over the last 6 months, been forced to. And I'm hoping to share a little bit about kind of what I've learned as I've engaged with this project and how we're looking at the days ahead. So really nice to be here. Maybe I get started and then Michael, pass to you for a bit. Thought we'd keep this really informal, just a few things from kind of what we've been up to, and then hopefully we can just have a chat and discuss any questions that you guys might have. And I'd love to learn a bit about how DSA has been thinking about this as well. So, as we think about, obviously the event today is about vaccine apartheid. What exactly does vaccine apartheid look like today? And why are we calling it that? I think simply put, you look at how many vaccinations, how many vaccines exist, how many people have been vaccinated all around the world. It's stark inequality, right, across the world. Where I am coming from right now in India, obviously we have one of the worst crises going on, as you all might have seen. We have about 400,000 infections coming up every single day and about 4,500 people dying again every single day. And these are numbers that are said to be hugely underreported by almost a factor of like 5 to 20 times, precisely because the government is kind of trying to keep these numbers down, doesn't want it to be reported. Again, one of the issues of having an incredibly fascist right-wing government, the Modi government, in power. Even with this situation and with one of the biggest pharmaceutical kind of industries that exist in India, have historically always existed in India, about just 2% of our population has been vaccinated so far, and we have our own vaccine that we've produced. I start with the story only to say that this isn't even the inequality that I'm talking about, right? Since the start of 2021, if you look at how many people have been vaccinated in high-income countries, on average, citizens have been vaccinated at the rate of 1 dose per second. And this in contrast with countries where, and there are many of these, especially poorer countries, low-income countries of the world, where not even a single dose or less than 1%, 0.1% of the population has been vaccinated. So if you look at the last year and a half of the pandemic, 84% of all the shots that have gone out have only gone to high-income, middle-income countries. And with Yemen or Central African Republic or Syria, Benin, there's close to zero. So it's something like 600 people in the Central African Republic, 3,000 people in Syria, whereas, where you are right now in the United States, it's close to 50%. And people estimate that everyone in the US is going to be vaccinated by the end of June or July. So why exactly do we find ourselves in this situation? Part of it is just that all of the vaccines that were developed, that were produced, have been completely bought up and have always been bought up. So this isn't a shocker in any way, in that it's a new thing that's just coming out in March and April and May as the vaccination has begun, right? As far back as October, when the first vaccine was just about being developed, already purchasing orders had been placed by US, by Europe, by multiple countries in Europe, definitely by the UK, by Canada, by Japan. And these are huge purchase orders, so huge that all the way up until kind of the end of 2021, anything that any of these vaccine manufacturing companies could potentially produce had all been spoken of. So back in October, we knew that none of the lower income countries would actually get anything like a reasonable amount of vaccine until 2022, which would have been 2 years after the pandemic had begun. So part of this is just that it's not a shock, but it's been hidden for quite some time. And now we're beginning to at least finally kind of acknowledge the apartheid situation that we do have when it comes to the access of the vaccine. The second is kind of this, the question of donations, right? And there's a lot of talk around this with people saying we can send some excess doses, we'll send it to a few different countries, and that's the way we really want to get out of this pandemic. And the truth is that you simply can't donate what isn't there. So there's no way to donate out of this pandemic because there are no vaccines in the first place to be given out of any kind of common pool that exists. And even those that do exist, I think it's at best by the end of 2021 is something like 3% of the population in lower income countries could potentially be vaccinated. This, again, in contrast with the US, which is estimated to have an excess of 1 billion doses by December of this year, because it's just hoarded so much and is sitting on this large supply that it doesn't want to send anywhere, that it doesn't want to give anywhere else, or allow other countries to produce more, precisely because of kind of this vaccine internationalism, where it holds a whole amount of power on what can be produced and what can be bought and where it can be sent. The only way out at this point is simply to produce more and to do it immediately. So this urgency, this question of doing it immediately, where does that come from? One of the things that's really shocking to me, and Michael and I were talking about this the other day as well, about how the urgency of the situation just simply isn't prevalent enough, because there is a bit of a complacency around the pandemic was here, but we now have a vaccine. And it looks like the end is in sight. It looks like we're getting out of the pandemic. The truth is that we're simply not, right? If you take South Africa as an example, which did not receive any vaccines for the longest time, and about 6 months after it initially made a request to receive the vaccine, finally started to get doses of AstraZeneca. But by the time it did, the virus had mutated. And the variant that then existed, AstraZeneca, was simply not powerful enough to prevent South Africa from kind of having a devastating second wave once again. And the same thing happened in the small town in Brazil, where everyone talked about it, there being herd immunity and them now being safe. But then there was a Brazil variant that came up, and it was so incredibly virulent that once again, no new vaccines that existed at the time could protect against it. So we're going to find ourselves in the situation of a continuous loop where the virus is always one step ahead of the vaccines that we have at any point, and it mutates to make sure that the previous vaccines that exist up until that point become completely obsolete. So the only way to win this, to get out of the pandemic, is to win this kind of race and essentially take over the virus before it can mutate and vaccinate the entire world. But this logic obviously is something that's entirely missing from the geopolitical kind of game as it exists right now, with some countries kind of believing that they can somehow essentially just push the pandemic out of just their own borders. As long as it goes out of the US, as long as it goes out of Canada and the UK, then the pandemic can continue to happen elsewhere, as previous pandemics have happened, right? This is essentially what the US's approach or the UK's approach has been to things like pneumonia, to things like malaria, where it's always a crisis happening elsewhere. So that's exactly the approach to this as well. A global crisis that affected them, that affected every single class of population in their own countries, into once again a crisis that's happening in poor countries elsewhere in the world, but just not within their own borders. So I want to return to this question of what exactly is the way out and what's kind of standing in our way. There's two things to any vaccine, and I'm going to let Michael talk a bit more about kind of the US situation. There's a legal question, which is, who can produce this vaccine, who has the permission to produce this vaccine, and that's what a lot of the TRIPS waiver is about. And the second is how to produce the vaccine. Is there a vaccine recipe that can teach people, that can teach different manufacturers, different labs to produce it. So the first on the legal question is obviously a question of intellectual property monopolies, which historically pharmaceutical companies have, through multiple mechanisms, held huge monopolies over, making sure that they're the only ones that could ever produce it. And they've never really had a challenge to this. Once again, returning to this question of what did we do when there was pneumonia? What did we do when there was malaria happening in other countries, right? This monopoly was never questioned. Western pharmaceutical companies continue to produce these, continue to hold patents and produce these different vaccines that then kind of smaller aid organizations, whether that's, foreign aid department of the UK or something like Gavi, which is the big vaccine alliance, used to buy from them, subsidize, and then give it away to poor countries. So we've never actually been faced with this situation where all of the countries wanted the same vaccine at the same time, where poorer countries were pit against rich countries in as direct a fashion as this. And the mediators who've always kind of held this, saviors of the world, going and vaccinating poor African children elsewhere, never had to deal with this question at all, because the diseases were never meant to be the same. They were never meant to be on the same playing field. So at this point, there's a few different questions that have come up. Who can actually produce this vaccine? And there are multiple manufacturers around the world who are saying, we're ready, we'll produce it. All we need is for you to share the tech. So there's, if one look at the news will tell you there are about 20 different factories in India that can do this. There are about 10 different factories in Africa that can do this. There are 3 in Denmark, there's 4 in Bangladesh, 6 in Pakistan, all of whom for the last year and a half have been trying to get the vaccine recipe from any one of these vaccine manufacturers to say, all you need to do is give it to us. We're not going to ask you for your existing supply. We're not going to take away from the US or from the UK. All we'll do is just produce some more, add to the pie, add to the existing pile, and then give it away to either our own countries or potentially even to other countries around us and help vaccinate the world. And there's been such a huge opposition to this question because of the nexus that exists between governments, especially global north governments, and kind of pharmaceutical companies, where there's a resistance to taking down intellectual property rights in any form whatsoever. So I want to address like a few things before, maybe passing to Michael, perhaps to talk a bit about the TRIPS waiver, which I know the US has won. The US activists have won a bit of victory on in the last couple of weeks, which has been a huge step forward, right? But part of the question has been how do you share the technology? And the opposition to this is incredibly silly, but also incredibly sinister, right? Companies like AstraZeneca have come out and said, oh, we really want to share the vaccine, but we just can't because we don't have enough scientists to go around and share the technology with. They can't actually travel, which is some of the most bizarre things, because it's as simple as like literally writing up a recipe and sending one technician along to a factory. You can even do it on video calls, as the Chinese Sinovac and Sinopharm have done with different people. But that happens to be one excuse that different people hold up. The other is even more sinister, right? I think it was someone from the US Trade Representatives Department who were like, oh, we can't take down intellectual property because what if China gets access to all of our life-saving technology? And this is just such a bizarre statement that I don't know why it was reproduced in all of the different news outlets in the US, because what if it does get access to life-saving technology? God forbid that they produce life-saving drugs using that technology, right? What else might one do with technology that can essentially help save lives? But obviously it's a bit of, same old Cold War fear that comes handy, as it always does for most US politicians trying to stop something from happening. And then there's a healthy dose of kind of racism, Orientalism that always goes along with any of these conversations, which is to say, they simply can't. You're all talking about us, forcing us to share the vaccine, but even if we shared the vaccine, there aren't any manufacturers, there aren't any facilities that could do this. And so you see this reflected in something like the China vaccines and the Russia vaccines that came out pretty much around the same time as Pfizer, as AstraZeneca, or Moderna, but did not receive the WHO rating, the approval from the World Health Organization, which essentially is simply a stamp, right, that allows other governments to say, okay, I trust this vaccine, I can give this out to my people without having to kind of go through the entire gamut of testing it once again and going through like 7 or 8, 9 months of trials once again, and get the vaccine faster to its people. The Chinese and the Russian vaccines were never given, the Russian vaccine still hasn't gotten the certification, but the Chinese vaccine, which just did earlier this month, got it, roughly about 7 months after Pfizer, about 4 months after AstraZeneca, and happened, I think, roughly 3 months after Moderna, despite coming out at the same time. And if you look at some of the meeting minutes, you speak to some of the activists who've worked on these things, you realize it's just a bunch of people sitting inside WHO saying things like, oh, the Chinese, they just don't know how to fill out the forms, and so we couldn't have certified it. But it obviously comes from very deep-seated kind of ideas of who can actually produce, who can be innovative, right, and who can make copies. So with the HIV vaccines, for instance, HIV antiretroviral drugs, for instance, there was kind of a change in ideology where a lot of people said, okay, India can actually produce generic versions of the HIV medicine. But even then, the kind of mindset shift there was India can produce copies of research and innovation that comes out of the West, right? But God forbid there actually be any innovation, any true original science that can potentially come from a non-Western country. And that's something that even in this day and age, we're still struggling with across all of these different institutions. Having said all of this, I want to say, I want to, again, I think there's very interesting stories to talk about kind of the AIDS fight, how we changed manufacturing technologies both in India and elsewhere. As activists, something to keep in mind very, very clearly, right? The whole narrative here has been about these kind of lower income countries, middle income countries going around with some version of a begging bowl, asking for vaccines, asking for donations of vaccines and how we should donate these. And the amount that's been given out, right, is so small. Like Biden sent 60 million doses to India the other day, and that wouldn't even be 1% of what we'd need to actually go anywhere. But that's kind of what the conversations revolved around. And so it's incredibly clear to kind of constantly get the narrative back to this, that no one's out there with a begging bowl. There are huge vaccine budgets. The African Union, someone from there who I was in conversation with earlier this week, was saying we have a $2 billion budget just for this month to purchase vaccines, but there just aren't any to buy, and we're not in front of the line, right? We've been pushed so far back to the line that it doesn't matter that we're sitting on all of this money. It doesn't matter that we're at the doors of Pfizer or Moderna with cash in our hand. They simply don't want to sell to us because they've already sold it to all of these different countries. So not only is it the case that they're not selling to us right now, but they're also preventing us from producing any to be able to save our own people. So I want to stop here. There's a few more things I want to say, but maybe I'll turn to Michael to tell us a little bit about the US situation and the TRIPS waiver, and then we'll come back.
Sure. Thanks so much, Varsha. And thanks, Chip and David, as always, for organizing this, and Varsha for being up at an ungodly hour. And I'm not sure if she mentioned, but it's like 5 a.m. there. But also the Wizards are playing a playing game right now, so I think I'm the one who's making the biggest sacrifice. But I'm happy to be here. As Chip said, it's a reintroduction. Michael Gallant, he, him pronouns, based in DC, occupied Nacotchtunk and Anacostan and Piscataway land. I'm a member of the Secretariat of the Progressive International, as well as the Secretariat of the DSA International Committee, where I organize the Econ and Trade Subcommittee. So I'm really glad that this is like bringing two wonderful organizations together. Varsha's the policy expert here, so I won't speak to that, but I wanted to bring this down to the level of the USA, the US context, as well as the role of DSA as a DSA member, to talk about what we've done, what we can do, what comes next. So as you all probably know, Biden 2 weeks ago now announced his support for a waiver on intellectual property rights for the COVID-19 vaccine. I want to make clear, as Varsha said, that this was a huge step forward. I'll get to the limits of it soon. I'll get to the how much more there needs to be done. But I really want to take a chance to like celebrate that this is not the war that was won, but the battle was won, and it is huge. I mean, Joe Biden, who we all know, taking on against tens of millions of dollars in big pharma money, huge pressure against it, decided that one of the defining sets of rules of one of the defining institutions of global neoliberalism is not good enough for the public good. And so we are going to waive those rules temporarily. That's not credit to Joe Biden. That's credit to the movement that forced him into that situation. We know that he would not have done that unless he was forced to. I don't think it would have been possible 2 years ago. I don't think it would have been possible 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I think this is a testament to the power of the left right now. And we don't get a lot of victories in what we do, so celebrate them when we do get them. So how did we get to that point? First, I want to talk about that. This was really sort of like a textbook inside outside organizing strategy along with international cooperation, right? So there was a wide coalition of groups from public health groups, doctors groups, labor, folks like Public Citizen was really big in this, Justice is Global, Citizens Trade Campaign, as well as DSA. We were a part of this. When DSA, the International Committee, put out our first statement on this, this was so early on, and people weren't in the US, people in the West were not talking about patents and what it was doing to block global vaccine access. Like, it was not part of the national conversation yet. We were at a point early on when we joined in these formations where if we saw a single small op-ed in a tiny left-wing publication, we'd be like, this is huge, like we did it, like we're making movement. And the movement really grew from there. So there was early on, just to talk a bit about like the steps of how this all went down. One of the earliest things was a CSO, civil society organization letter signed by over 400 organizations. DSA International Committee was a part. We had sporadic op-eds and the like. And then things really started to shift, in my opinion, with a global day of action, maybe mostly US, mostly East Coast, but a day of action that was in at least Boston, New York, Philly, DC, as well as in London and South Africa and a few other places here or there, I think Brazil. There were actions usually at pharma headquarters, often at maybe US embassies and the like, calling for a TRIPS waiver. So that was one of the biggest things. DSA was involved early in those, the Boston DSA working group, internationalism working group, had a part, the DC DSA, both shout outs to Abel and the Medical for All working group and Elliot in internationalism who really took this on. And so we had actions here. Things started to change more there. It was Progressive International and Data for Progress put out this sort of breaking poll about the fact that the majority, 60-something% of the US public supported a TRIPS waiver. There was a letter from 170 world leaders and Nobel laureates. There was a letter from senators, Bernie Sanders was leading on that. All of this putting pressure on the Biden administration, because this was the Biden administration's decision to change the US. They have the power to change the US position on this. I think technically it's the US Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, who holds it, but she was going to follow the administration's decision. Again, so building up power, there was a week of action, things started to change. Like there was a palpable shift in how people were talking about this. The fact that it moved out of just little left-wing circles and into the mainstream. I know that when I get a phone call from my parents and they're like, oh, we're watching The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. What's this? What do you think about this vaccine thing? That's how you know that you've been hitting the big time. And then DSA, a lot of the work that we did, we put into, and I'll preface this by saying that I'm as skeptical of parliamentarism and electoralism and all that as the next guy. And this doesn't sound like the most like exciting, like hard-hitting direct action strategy, but part of this inside-outside strategy is that we had folks part of this coalition who were in talks with the administration all the time. And one of the things that they heard is that Biden was most susceptible to the idea that he was out of touch with the Democratic caucus. He was going to be malleable. It just depended on whether or not he looked in touch or out of touch. And so a lot of our effort that went into this was towards getting members of Congress to publicly call on him via a letter to support the waiver. And so DSA, as a part of the International Committee, helped to organize. We had chapters across the country, Missouri, Minnesota, and Virginia, and Massachusetts, all put pressure on their respective members of Congress to publicly call on Biden for this waiver. Again, I know there are like a few steps in between thing, like it doesn't sound like the most direct or powerful action, but there were genuinely multiple times when our DSA chapter reached out to their member of Congress one day and the next day they signed on to this open letter. Not to say that that was remotely the only thing, but like it was a part of the pressure that they were feeling. So ultimately this letter from members of Congress came out, reached the majority of Democrats in the House of Representatives, which is huge. The day after that came out, Biden made his announcement. Again, there are so many things that went into this fight, so many different pieces. I'm not trying to attribute anything, and especially not to DSA, who played one small role. Not least, I should say, because so much of this victory is also owed to AIDS activists and those who fought a very similar fight in the late 90s and early 2000s, especially people who literally fought and died on the question of intellectual property and access to medicines. But I think it is a testament to DSA, the fact that we have power across the country, the fact that we have electeds that we can call on to take action, and the DSA International Committee, I'm not speaking for them, I'm speaking from my own opinion. I liked that this was a coordinating function, right? DSA International Committee worked on the national level to help coordinate on this internationalist issue and drew on the power of our base around the country. So again, that's the long story, but that's what led to this win. It was a real win. It is clearly very much not over. Immediately, Biden was hit with a huge amount of pushback. Pharma was like in shock that he would do this, already pouring incredible resources into this and just poured more and more. So a few things that are really important to take from here on is, one, the Biden administration announced their support for a waiver. That is very different than a support for the waiver as currently proposed by South Africa and India. That was going to happen regardless. We knew that there would be negotiations to be done, but there's a lot of room for the text to be watered down in the course of negotiations. One important piece of that is that the Biden administration in their announcement said that they supported a waiver on intellectual property for the COVID vaccine. This is about way more than vaccine. This is about diagnostics, this is about therapeutics, this is about all that goes into the vaccine, this is every piece of the process. What's really important is that after this fight had been had around AIDS in the late 90s and early 2000s, and there were some exceptions made for public health to intellectual property, pharma responded by creating what is called like an intellectual property thicket. They have just decided to make an incredibly dense, interwoven set of all different intellectual property, not just patents, but also copyrights, software technology. You have to have particular software to produce this particular thing, biologics, all sorts of things. They've created this thicket. And so it's one of the reasons that the waiver is so necessary, is because you can't just call for single compulsory licenses and just a license to produce this vaccine, because a single patent license means nothing if this entire chain of production is still this like thicket of obstruction. So that's one fight. This has to be not just COVID, not just vaccines, but all COVID supplies, everything that's needed. Not just patents, but all intellectual property. Luckily, the Biden administration, that is their position. They said an intellectual property waiver, not just a patent waiver. And importantly, the WTO right now, they're talking about text-based negotiation. So moving from just talking about it as an abstract concept and looking at the text of the waiver and like getting into the nitty-gritty of what that waiver looks like legally. They're talking about text-based negotiations having a deadline of, I think they're saying November or December now. I want to be clear, that is unacceptable. There are thousands of people dying every day in the meantime. We truly just, the world cannot wait until November, December. So anything to push this up now. And then of course, there are other countries. The US was not the only one obstructing things. There are still other countries out there who are blocking the way. The WTO generally operates on a principle of consensus, so we need pretty wide support. And so that's what needs to be done on the TRIPS waiver in order to make this meaningful, in order to make it complete, in order to make it done soon. There's also, as Varsha had pointed out, so much more than just the intellectual property question. There is global north hoarding of vaccines. There is knowledge sharing. Again, pharmaceutical companies need to like train other, not that companies in the global south don't have the capacity to make things, but there are certain things that like you need the sharing of know-how that is embodied in like professionals. So they need to be trained. There needs to be a sharing of knowledge, and that needs to be compelled by the government. We can't rely on pharmaceutical corporations to do this of the goodness of their own heart. We need to be providing resources, really all the things that Varsha just mentioned. There's so much more to the vaccine apartheid fight than just this intellectual property question. But the intellectual property question is huge, and that's why we've been fighting so much on it. All that to say that I want to make clear that this has to be not the end of the fight, but the beginning of it. The fact that there was a victory is not reason to let up now. It's reason to fight harder than ever, especially as pharma has ramped up their side of things. And frankly, the media and the sort of more the center has lost attention. They heard Biden's announcement. They kind of they said, all right, that's it, we're done, and they're moving on. So it's going to be a harder fight now, and the fight has to be kept up. Beyond, this goes beyond vaccine apartheid too, right? We are fighting right now for global vaccine access because we're in a pandemic, because there are millions of lives at risk, because it is all that we can do to keep people alive in this moment. But we can never let that be the end of our ambition. A temporary waiver on one disease's intellectual property is not the end of our ambition. We need to use this as a wedge, to use this to build power, so that people understand right now in this COVID case that how utterly absurd it is that we have a current system where, in a global pandemic where all these people are dying, a few pharmaceutical corporations can just say no to other companies producing things. It's absurd. All this polling, thanks to Progressive International and Data for Progress, has shown that the US public is ready for a change. They see the absurdity of it. Our job is to make sure that that is an inroad to seeing the absurdity of the entire global system, and to fight for global level change of all the structures, changing, especially when it comes to climate change, right? The climate crisis, we need to utterly transform the patent system for that as well. We need an injection of liquidity into the global south via IMF special drawing rights. We need global south debt relief. We need to compel green technology sharing from the global north to global south. We need an end to IMF and World Bank austerity conditions. We need a global Green New Deal. All of this on the path to, as socialists, global socialist transformation, and the sort of unfettering of the global south, right? That probably goes without saying in all that we do, but I think it is worth saying. We can't lose sight of the horizon of our ambitions as we fight for what is necessary to save lives in the immediate term.
Thank you so much, Michael and Varsha. I don't know if any more thoughts, or if we should go to questions and answers, or what should we do at this point?
That's all I had. I'm happy to go to question and answer.
So, Michael, you spoke a bit about what happened with treatment for AIDS and HIV, which, for people who aren't familiar with that, what happened with sort of those drugs? How was it different from what happened now, and how much of a historic break is the current moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing to make clear, I just want to make sure that I get this right from the start. People talk about the AIDS crisis in the past. The AIDS crisis is continuing right now. I'll speak to what was the peak of the AIDS crisis, because there was much less knowledge then, much less treatment then, much more stigma then, but the AIDS crisis is ongoing. So at the end of the 90s and early 2000s, the AIDS crisis was massive, one of the leading causes of deaths, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. We got to a point at that time where there was the introduction of antiretroviral therapy, which was, I don't want to exaggerate too much, but people who took it literally described it as miraculous, like life-changing. No longer was HIV/AIDS an immediate death sentence. It was, you could continue to live a life feeling like your full self for a very long time. It was totally out of the reach of the vast majority of the world. It was, sorry, I'm seeing questions come in. I won't read them as I talk. So it was totally out of the reach of the vast majority of the world. The same issue was happening. Companies in the global north held the patents for these. Generics were not being allowed to be produced. People were dying across the global south at incredible rates, while people in the global north who could afford it, whose insurance could afford it, were living. We're taking antiretroviral therapy and living. There was an incredible transnational fight, specifically centered around South Africa and India. It's no coincidence that those are the two that put forth this waiver proposal in the WTO now. India has a long history, Varsha can speak to this better than I can, of the production of generics of medicine that was sort of a decision post-independence, as like a sense of independence and sovereignty, that we would need to produce our own medicines. So this was especially a bad fight in South Africa. At the time, it was the same. TRIPS was newer at the time. The world TRIPS being the trade-related agreement on intellectual property that I've been referring to. It's the WTO rules on intellectual property. And that was sort of, this was, people knew when that was first instituted that it would be harmful for access to medicines, but this was sort of it first coming to a head in that people dying all across the global south. It was because of the same intellectual property question. And there was a massive movement. I won't go into the whole story of like how it was won. President Bush played a weird role with like PEPFAR, where he accidentally quoted one price that was the generics price, and then he like tried to walk it back. But all to say, like eventually there was a willful breaking of the rules, in part in India, and I think Uganda and elsewhere, to start producing these medicines in violation of TRIPS. There was a huge, massive pressure, and ultimately it resulted in part in the Doha Declaration on the, I won't get the exact title right, the Doha Declaration on TRIPS, which is a declaration sort of clarifying the intellectual, basically of the WTO, saying, hey, intellectual property, you can you can have some exceptions when it comes to global public health crises. So what's important is that those exceptions allow for sort of individual case, country by country exceptions based on individual medicines. So it was much easier to say like, this is the specific antiretroviral therapy medicine, like, okay, South Africa, you can produce this. The difference now is in part, one, this thicket that I talked about. Pharmaceutical companies have created this whole new system of protecting themselves from this. It is not just a single medicine, it is this entire process. It is all the software that goes along with it. It's all the intellectual property that goes along with it. It is not just this single medicine, it is vaccines, it is treatments, it's literally masks, ventilators, all the intellectual property there is just as important. And that's the real reason why this Doha Declaration, these individual licenses are totally inadequate, why we need, why we're calling for this blanket waiver is because it's necessary to break through this thicket of intellectual property. I'll leave to Varsha if she has anything to add there on the AIDS crisis. But just to say again, we stand on the shoulders of giants. People fought and died for it. They fought pushed the movement forward. What they won was essentially minor exceptions, and especially on AIDS treatment. And it just was not the radical transformation that we need. And so we knew that this was coming. People at the time wrote, if we don't do more, the next time that there's a big public health crisis, this will come again. And it came again.
Varsha, do you have any thoughts on that, or?
I think Mike covered it, but I'm happy
Okay.
to answer some of the questions. that I
Yeah,
see.
I'll read off the audience questions. We've got 2 questions and 1 statement. The first question is just a clarifying question, and I think you would know the answer, Varsha. The question is, the U.S. will have an access of 1 billion doses, while India has only 2% of its populations. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think as of today, we're up to something like 10%. The 2% was at the time that US was inching towards 35, 37%. We were still at 2%, which is essentially when all of Biden's statements about donating were coming in. But I think, unless I'm wrong, as of today, should be somewhere between 10 to 11% for us. But we've also very quickly hit a wall against how many vaccines we can produce. And because there's only 2 factories, even within our own country, that have been producing it, because our own Indian vaccine was also patented and the technology wasn't shared. And just last week, the Indian government was finally forced, again, because of public pressure, to say, fine, we're going to force this company to share it with all of the other idle manufacturers, of which there are at least 22, to start producing this vaccine, which is so bizarre. You wouldn't think it would take this long for our own government to share our own vaccine with our own manufacturers that exist within our borders. But even there, the kind of hold of profit over people is so strong that it took kind of this long, and like a huge amount of agitation for that to finally happen. And then the excess of the 1 billion doses thing, I actually have to pull up the specific article, but there's about 4 to 5 different scenarios that have been modeled on, what are the different vaccination rollout that the US could take, whether it goes to children first or it kind of does everyone at once, it does it regionally. It really depends on how the factories go out. But the range of surplus vaccine doses that this one particular study, but a few other studies that have collaborated with these researchers as well have estimated is somewhere between 350 million excess doses to anything like 1 billion doses. So that's from across the 4 different scenarios that have been modeled. So either way, an outrageous number, but that's the range.
Well, thank you very much for that. And then the other question we have is, do we know the effectiveness of the Chinese and Russian vaccines? Is it a viable avenue for low-income countries to be able to vaccinate their populations before 2022?
Yes. I mean, I'm not a scientist in any way, so this is not me speaking from kind of an understanding of that, but the Chinese and the Russian vaccines have both been proven to be extremely effective. And actually, they're the ones that a lot of the developing countries are now using, because once again, something like the Pfizer vaccine, for instance, is just really hard to store, right? It needs some temperatures like minus 60 degrees or things like that, which where in a lot of countries where there simply isn't any infrastructure to do that kind of cold storage, even if there were to be doses that were sent, they would never be able to be distributed in time before the vaccines went bad because of the temperatures. So the whole host of obstacles like that, but the Chinese and Russian vaccines, as of now, there are 2 Chinese vaccines, Sinopharm and Sinovac, and then the Russia one is Sputnik V. But both of those have been sent out to different places. The Russian one has not received the WHO certification yet. The Chinese one just did last week, but many different countries, especially in the Gulf. So the UAE, I think, has vaccinated almost its entire population. Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Pakistan, some countries in Eastern Europe, Serbia, I think Hungary, Morocco, all of these have received the vaccine from China, and both of these vaccines, it's important to mention, are completely open access, right? So the recipe is just out there. And so if there are any manufacturers that can potentially, if their factories, kind of the facilities fit that particular kind of vaccine, can start to also produce it in-house. Things that are standing in the way are precisely the kind of essentially perceptions of distrust. Oh, it's coming from China, it's coming from Russia. Is it actually good? A lot of it that has been peddled by Western media, who've constantly pit Chinese and Russian vaccines against the ones coming from the West. Every time there are reports about, oh, the best of the vaccines have gone here, have gone there, Chinese and Russian vaccines have actually been left out of the list altogether. And things like, of course, kind of different geopolitics. India, for instance, would actually really benefit from getting the Chinese vaccine, which is open access, and producing that, because it also happens to be, from what I hear, one of the simplest vaccines to make. But we are currently caught in this standoff war over a tiny, tiny piece of land on our border, where no one has lived there for like the last, 20,000 years. But we are in this, in this standoff at this point. So our government doesn't want to take any vaccines from the Chinese, any vaccine technology from the Chinese. So that's I suppose a longer war to win as we fight things at DSA, at Fascism International, and all of the things that we do.
So I'm going to do a last call for questions. People have questions, please put them in the chat. And then we have a comment from Morgan, and in the spirit of open discussion, I will read this comment. This isn't really a question, but you would think that a global pandemic that had a global effect on the function of neoliberal capitalism, there would be an incentive to give the vaccine out based on need, not who has the most money. But given that it's the Western countries that are at the front of the line, I could see the disparity be used as disallowing low-income, non-Western people from immigrating into high-income Western countries. You would think we would give the vaccine out based on something other than profit, but we're not. I feel like we're not the decision-making class on this panel.
But I think something to that's always important to remind ourselves of is it's not just kind of an absent system, like an inactive system that's just been built and we're trying to take it down, right? It's actively fighting back. So if you look at kind of how much big pharma has spent on lobbying just in the US alone in the last 20 years, it's something like $6 billion. And that's just what investigative journalists have been able to pull up by donations like campaign funds, for instance. There's a whole host of amounts that are expected to have kind of exchanged hands behind closed doors. And you should remember that given that all of this has come out in the last year, right? About it's taxpayer money. It's essentially your money, actually, all of you sitting in the US, that's gone into funding something close to $1 billion for Moderna, more than $1 billion for Johnson & Johnson. So it goes to these pharma companies who then essentially funnel it back in the form of bribes back to your politicians so that they can keep these vaccines from you or make you pay twice for it. It's free for the first time in the US, which is I know shocker to everyone. But otherwise you're paying for drugs like two times, three times over, both at the point of when your taxpayer money is actually going into the research, and then again at the point when you actually go spend money to buy it and take it. So that's one, to kind of remember the kind of stronghold that pharma lobby does have over politicians all over the world. And the second is just, it's so insidious, right? They're everywhere. Like there was a report that came out in The Intercept just yesterday about how there's a debate between two of our members, one who is the head of the vaccine delivery program at the African Union, Yodi Alakaja, and Achal Prabhala, who happens to be a health rights activist from India and then has also worked in South Africa and Brazil, also during some of the big fights with the AIDS movement there. And a professor from Duke University. So the two of them, Achal and Yuri, were pro the waiver, pro kind of producing more. And this professor from Duke University was against kind of taking down pharma intellectual property rights. And a quick Google search by Achal before this interview happened, which was happening in Al Jazeera, made him realize that the center or wherever this particular professor from Duke worked was essentially funded, and their entire program funded by Pfizer. And this was an easy thing to discover, but if you look at the article and you look at every single time there have been spokespeople basically speaking pro big pharma, but they're not pharma officials, right? They're ostensibly professors, researchers, kind of just activists from elsewhere who really believe in intellectual property rights. It is so easy to kind of discover these links where big pharma has been funding, essentially planting people to kind of shift the public opinion, shift the public discourse towards in their favor across the board throughout this entire year and well before that. So I think it's just, you're always kind of fighting against the machine, and it's you have to keep kind of hammering away at any critical openings that we find. But it's also I like, sorry, I wanted to say it's also just shocking to me, like Michael and I talk about this, and I was saying this to someone else today, it is absolutely shocking to me that we don't have like a single whistleblower from within big pharma, like exactly like Morgan's comment here. Like you would think that a crisis as horrible as this would finally make one scientist who I want to believe kind of came into this field because they actually wanted to produce something that was life-saving, to come out and make a statement, to come out and reveal kind of technology, any kind of a whistleblower. And it's truly shocking to me personally. Maybe this is me being somewhat naive from where I'm sitting, but that it hasn't happened in this pandemic.
I also want to, sorry, I'll be very quick, just make clear that it's not just the influence of big pharma. This is an ideological fight. Like the capital class understands what it would mean to do away with what they see as a defining feature of property rights, this intellectual property right. It would be a crack in the dam that they absolutely don't want. So in the same way that in the AIDS fight, there was very little money to be made in selling these drugs to the global south at the time. Like Africa was like collectively, I think 0.5% of something like that, less than 1% of the potential revenue of pharma at the time. But it was ideological. They did not want to lose on this one front, because if they did, who knows what that would unleash.
Okay, we've got some more questions. We've got, in regards to the ongoing vaccine apartheid, what do you think the political effects will be? It seems to me that the variants will embolden tighten borders and strengthen fascism across the world.
Feels like a question for Varsha and Modi's India.
That's not funny, but
I don't know. I mean, it's really entirely tragic, right? The tighter borders thing, I think, is part of it just comes from a real arrogance, but also real ignorance of how the virus moves. And that really it is completely like just vicious idiocy of different governments in the world that think that they can keep the pandemic out of their borders. I think we'll very quickly realize that that's simply not the case. The strengthening of fascism, I think it's very different case to case. Like in our case, for instance, we actually have a completely missing government. So there was a piece by Arundhati Roy, who writes incredibly sharply, last week for the first time, actually saying, you know what, like I cannot believe I'm writing this, but I want Modi to come back and put in a COVID task force. I'm actually asking for Modi, the person that all of us believe should not exist, to come back and govern us, because in this moment of crisis, we actually need any government, some government, to help us get out of this pandemic. Because right now the situation here is that it's just criminal neglect. But it's also been, it's also pushed activists to kind of take stances that we otherwise haven't before, and kind of really, really state the stakes of the debate in the sharpest terms possible. So one of the good examples of this is in Brazil, where all of the healthcare workers, who are obviously the biggest kind of, who are at the front line, who have the most to lose in this crisis, who all essentially put in a case to the International Criminal Court, asking for Bolsonaro to be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, for criminal neglect of the pandemic. So that in one kind of fell swoop, I think they make it very clear this isn't about mismanagement. This isn't simply about a difference in kind of policy governance and how right-wing government might govern differently from a left-wing government. This is simply a crime against humanity, and the reason people are dying in Brazil and the reason people are dying in India is something that both of these leaders should be prosecuted for. So I actually do have more hope, I think, which is not something that I'm not usually this optimistic, but I do think I do think we'll come out of this better.
Okay, and then we have a final question from David. You mentioned polling showing that the public supports sharing the vaccines with other countries, which is interesting given how much the Biden administration, the drug companies, have made this about competing with China. But do you know if this is more about sympathy, or do people realize how much it is in the interest of US citizens to stamp out the pandemic globally, i.e., solidarity, interconnected fates? It seems like even domestically, the discourse around the vaccine misses the social level, focusing entirely at the individual level.
I think I think you're right. I think that's part of kind of why I started the way that I did, with the urgency of it really missing, because we're all misunderstanding the pandemic in a certain way. We're all misunderstanding the situation a certain way. Having said that, with this particular polling, and I've now had conversations with a few different people and been looking at campaigns that have been coming up in support of Cuba, for instance, and the lifting of the Cuba embargo, US embargo on Cuba. And there's been a huge amount of support for campaigns. Right now, Cuba doesn't have syringes to make its vaccine, and there's a Canada campaign in support of that, with People's Forum, with Code Pink here in the US, and it's had more support than any Cuba campaigns have had in the previous decades. So I think there is kind of a shifting of public opinion and understanding of how all of these things are entirely interconnected. You realize there's simply no way that you can either produce a vaccine or stamp out a virus without working with each other. So maybe actually I'd flip that question and say, maybe from here we actually get to a more clearer understanding that actually solidarity does mean interconnected fates, as opposed to the other way around, where I can't quite answer where the solidarity is coming from, that understanding, but I think from this moment we might get there.
Michael, do you have a response to that?
It's hard to disentangle. I mean, I have to hope that there is, despite all the attempts to turn things into nationalist competition, that some sense of interconnectedness has been born from the global pandemic. There is a sense of, I worry that it's changing now, because now that people are vaccinated and it feels like the pandemic is ending here and we can go back to our restaurants and things. I worry that it's ending now, but there was a moment there where, at least in my extremely subjective opinion, it felt like people understood that we were like all experiencing the same problem globally. I hope that there's some sense of solidarity that arises from that. I hope that this is out of a sense of the interconnectedness of our global economy and the need to create change to benefit all of us. It's hard to say. It's a great question. Can't know, but I like to have hope.
All right, Varsha and Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I think this was a really great event. I've been really admiring a lot of the work that Progressive International has done on vaccine apartheid, on illegitimate debt, in observing elections in Latin America, on Julian Assange, and obviously I'm on the Democratic Socialists of America's International Committee with Michael, so we've been doing a lot of really great work as well, and the local DC DSA does a lot of great work. So it was good to bring our three organizations together in one socialist night school. And hopefully this is the beginning of collaboration between us and the Progressive International, not the end of it.
Very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.